I'm fortunate that I have survived this industry. This industry takes no prisoners. Music is a life commitment. You know, something that you do all day, every day. It's not a part-time job. Every one person, there's a million people wanting to take your spot or your place in life without even knowing what's involved. For me, it all started when I was about 10 years old. I used to go to a Catholic school in the Bronx. And every day after school, we would walk down 3rd Avenue to get to where I lived in the projects. And there was a record shop there called Stan's Records. And one day, the owner, Stan, asked me if I wanted a job. He says, I just want you to sit in this chair and make sure nobody steals. So he offered to give me 1045s every Friday. He says, on Friday, I'll give you 1045s. And I was like, oh, this is great. You know, I'm gonna get 45s for free. But what ended up happening was, it was never just 1045s, because Tuesday was record day. So every Tuesday, the record stores would get all their new records. So as I was putting them in, I'd say, oh, this one's for me, that one's for me. At the end of the week, my records was way more than 10. Unfortunately, my father got wind of all this, went to the record shop and told Stan that I couldn't do it anymore. I wasn't eating lunch, I was doing my homework, I was just doing records, and that's where it all started for me. For me, the transition from being that 10-year-old kid that worked at the record shop to playing records was my father and his brother purchased a bar in Jersey City. So my father knew that I had all these records, and I would just play records just to entertain people while they were drinking. And then from there we moved to the Bronx and I started playing the guitar. We had a rock band. I loved music. It didn't matter what kind of music was. If I liked the song, I liked the song. Whether it was Sam and Dave, whether it was the Beatles, whether it was the Dave Clark 5, whether it was Tammy White, whatever it was, if I liked the song, I liked the song. It didn't matter what the genre was. So it was all just the love of the music. I wasn't, according to my father, the best of kids. I wasn't big at school, so I was always cutting and in the park. So I got a job working at Alexander's on 59th Street. And one night, we're like, you know, doing the stock and I'm walking down the back and there was like a big case of pistachios that had busted open. So every time I walked by, I'd grab a couple of pistachios and I would eat them. I had to go home and tell my father that I got fired. Well, I was 17 years old and my father said I had to go into the Army. I joined the Air Force the last year that they would take somebody under 18 with parent consent. First day that I get to Colorado Springs, ENT Air Force Base, I go in, I get my room, guy knocks on the door, I open the door, a guy rushes in and tries to kill me. And people rush in the room, pull this guy off me. I had no idea what was going on. And after that, the guy says, that's Crazy Joe. And I'm like, what are you talking about, Crazy Joe? He says, at night, you can't open your door. Joe's crazy, come back from Vietnam, and he was just crazy. After that, I did one term in Vietnam. I did the Air Force radio. So I always somehow got involved in music, and that was my second transition. And then in 1972, I came back home. My parents were immigrants from Puerto Rico. Got married, had me and my sister. My parents worked very hard, 2, 3 jobs. My father was a factory worker, but he was a singer in Puerto Rico. So we did have a lot of Latin music playing in the house. You know, they always say mothers love the sons, the fathers love the daughters. There wasn't anything that my mother wouldn't do for me. There was a lot of times in my 20s and stuff when I wasn't doing good that I would go to my mother and say, you know, can't pay the rent, I need money for the rent or this, and you know, she would sneak something and take care of me. I had a difficult relationship with my dad because he was really old school strict. So I took quite a few beatings from my father, but when I got older, I realized that my father was just trying to save me from the streets. You know, because I was always in the park, I was playing basketball, I was drinking beer, you know, and stuff like that. And, you know, they were very strict, and it's not something he wanted for me. And when I got into music, my father didn't like it either because he thought that music was basically for drunks and drug addicts. You know, my mother would say, oh, look at John, you know, he's got a record, you know, and he was like, no, it's just drug addicts. They worked hard. They put me and my sister through Catholic school. You know, in a way I owe to them who I am today. So when I came back from the service, I needed to get a job, and I got a job working at the post office as a postal policeman. I don't even know what I was doing. Just walking around, making sure nobody stole or, you know, the US mail is like sacred. Eventually I got fired from the post office. But during that time, I was still doing little DJ jobs at different clubs and bars in the Bronx. In 1976, I went to work for the New York Telephone Company. During the period of 74 to 76 was when I was starting to experiment with the edits. My first edit was Date with the Rain, Eddie Kendricks. You know, I did the edit using the pause on a cassette deck, and I found Sunshine Sound at 1050 Broadway. I did not know at the time that Patrick Adams, Red Greg, Randy Muller, Midsong International, Red Greg Records, they all were in that same building. And they had all their acetates pressed by Sunshine Sound. Frank mentioned to Greg and Patrick that there's this DJ that's doing these mixes that everybody's buying the acetate. You know, mind you, in this place, you also had Paul Simpson was going, Francois was going there, Jay Negron, a lot, you know, that ended up being the hub of where people were going. So one day I go into Sunshine Sound and Frank says to me, go downstairs to the 8th floor and go see Greg Carmichael. You know, they want you to do a record. I walk into the studio, and behind the glass, I didn't know who she was Jocelyn Brown singing Caught Up in a One Night Love Affair. And that was the first record I ever mixed. Little did we know in the background, on the business end of it, Greg was selling a record that he didn't own. The record becomes a hit in New York radio, on KISS and BLS, and now there's a bidding war between Prelude, Mark Schlachter, and Corey Robbins. And Greg makes a deal with Mark for the record that he doesn't own. From there, spawned the next 3 or 4 years of my career, because everything that Patrick and Greg did, I had a hand on. Whether it was Leroy Burgess and Log, Conversion, Barely Breaking Even, Jocelyn Brown, Inner Life, I was involved in every one of those records. So the way that I met Sergio Munzabai, who later on went to be my partner, when we took Caught Up in a One Night Love Affair up to BLS, Sergio was Frankie Crocker's assistant program director. So he was responsible for bringing the music to Frankie, for Frankie to approve to put on the station. At that time, they started what they were calling the Friday night dance party, which was that they were taking local DJs and letting them submit 1-hour mixtapes for them to play Friday nights between 2 to 4 a.m. So I got Sergio to let me submit a couple of tapes. And through the course of that, over a couple of months, we became friends. And Sergio calls me one day and he says, I got a call from South Soul Records. They want me to mix a record, but I don't know what to do. And I told him, I said, have them book a session at Blank Tapes with Bob Blank, because they already work there. I'll come down and I'll help you. The record ended up being Instant Funk's No Stopping That Rockin'. I had already done a lot of work at the studio, so I knew everyone. And I was kind of walking Sergio through it. And during the course of the night, we realized that we really got along well. Ideas met, and I just told myself, well, why don't we just partner up and call it, Munzabai Morales Eminem Mix. And that's how the Eminem Mix was born. Me and Sergio, we probably mixed close to 1,000 records. Fantastic Aleem's Hooked on Your Love, Get Down Friday Night, Rod Stewart, Do You Think I'm Sexy, Harold Faltermeyer, Axel F, Thompson Twins, Aretha Franklin, the Rolling Stones, Too Much Blood, Ashford and Simpson, Commodore's Night Shift, Temptations, Treat Her Like a Lady, Vanity Six, DeBarge, Rhythm of the Night, big records. The thing about me and Sergio was we loved the underground. So we did a lot of obscure records that were big in New York clubs, but nobody else would know them, like, IRT, which was on RCA, Miami Sound Machine. I met Gloria and Emilio Estefan, when they lived in Jersey City, when they were a salsa band. And Miami Sound Machine was just, beginning with Kunga, and Augie Darnell, B-52s. I remember myself walking through the halls of Blank Tapes. Mark Kamers, God bless his soul, rest in peace, there with Madonna, when he was doing her demos. For me, it's a magical time. I wish that I could say that period was nothing but wine and roses. I got involved in drugs because we were just spending so much time in the studio. Coffee wasn't really working for us, and we were spending from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. We'd be walking out like zombies, and slowly cocaine and speed got introduced into the whole studio environment. The whole remixing thing was something new. We were just hired as DJs to make dance-friendly records to introduce them into the clubs. All of a sudden now, we're doing massive amounts of cocaine in the studio. It got so bad that I didn't want to share the drugs that I had with anybody else. So I would find myself constantly running to the toilet. So I wouldn't let the other guys in the studio know that I had my own little private stash, which in retrospect is pretty sad. We're doing a Aretha Franklin remix at Blank Tapes. This was like a break point for me. I remember going into the studio. First thing I did was rush to the toilet to get my couple lines in. And I remember standing in the toilet and saying to myself, I'm like, you're mixing an Aretha Franklin record and you're more concerned about hiding in the bathroom to do your lines of coke because you don't want to share. And I realized that day that I had a problem. During that period, we were managed by Brad Lebeau. And customary, normally in the morning, we would take a cassette and go up to the office to play Brad what we did. And I kind of remember going up to the office that day and Brad listening to it and saying, Brad had a certain way of kind of letting you know he didn't like something, he kind of had this look. And I'm like, oh, what's the matter? He says, I'm not really feeling it. It made me realize that I spent most of the night hiding in the toilet, getting high rather than doing the mix. And my manager at the time telling me that the mix wasn't good. For me, that was a real big pivotal point. We get the gig to mix Too Much Blood. Very complicated technical mix because it involves syncing up 3 machines. Well, evidently somebody erased the beginning of one, so we had to manually start it all the time. So Mick comes in, him and Keith were drunk, or they were high, whatever, but they weren't totally there. So I had a friend of mine who came to the studio because I was like, oh, Stones, I want to get a photo. So I asked Mick if I can take a photo, and he said no. Broke my heart. It was snowing that morning, so I go to leave and I'm looking for my coat, and my coat's missing. Somebody took my coat. I don't have keys to get home. It's snowing. I jump in the cab. I get to the Bronx. I have to wait for my partner to get home. A week later, I'm looking in Billboard magazine and there's a picture of Mick Jagger and he's wearing my coat. What the? And I said, Brad, I said, Mick stole my freaking coat. He said, well, what are you talking about? I'm like, he's in Billboard wearing my coat. So we ended up calling Tony King, which was their management, and he says, oh yeah, he does this all the time. Just let us know how much it is, we'll pay for it. And I was like, I want my coat back, you know? I bought that coat in London on Bond Street. You know, that coat means sentimental value, you know? I never got the coat back. You know, we got paid for it, but I would have took the coat. Between 1981 and 1988, 89, me and Sergio were really prolific and mixing, really, really busy. We get a gig doing a band in Hawaii called Is. Free trip to Hawaii, we're there. Sergio got like real sick, like a cold or a flu or something. None of us really thought much of it, except that he was sick, he was running a fever, his bed. Later to find out that that was the onset of AIDS for him. You know, but nobody knew what it was, you know, so we didn't see the first signs of what it was. Sergio just came back and, you know, was feeling a little bit better, you know, the fever went away and stuff, but we didn't realize that that was the beginning of what ended up, you know, being AIDS, which eventually ended up taking his life in 1991. We stopped working together in 1989. You know, we mutually decided we had a big run. Music was changing. You know, hip hop was becoming real relevant. Dance music, nobody was interested in. And it kind of was an ideal moment for us to kind of take a break, regroup, and just kind of figure out where we were gonna go with our individual futures. You know, Sergio moved on with his partner, and I went on, you know, doing other things. Today, you know, I still carry the Eminem moniker, you know, in tribute, you know, to the foundation that we that we put down, you know, make sure that the quality of my work today is, you know, the same as it was, you know, 40 years ago. When we were mixing records, getting $1,500 to mix a record, we thought was great. We had no money. You know, I tell people, I says, I miss my calling because I hear some guys getting 25, 30, 35, 50,000 in the 90s to mix big records. Whitney used to mix for 50 grand, Madonna for 30 grand. And I'm like, dude, we didn't earn 50 grand in our whole career of almost 10 years. I moved to Philadelphia and I moved in with somebody that I was dating at the time. And a year after I moved into Philly, she developed brain cancer and died. I had no money to pay the electric, no money to pay the gas. My water got turned off. So I was living in this row home in Philadelphia with no lights, no electricity, and no water. And I had these gold records on my wall. And every night I'd sit on the couch and I'd stare at them. And I would say to myself, I'm like, what happened? I had some really, really hard times. I had no food to eat. You know, I had to jimmy rig the meter in the back to try to get some electricity. And one day I discovered the internet. I typed in John Morales. And boom, my name came up. John Morales mixed these records back in the 80s, blah, 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 blah. And I started to feel better about myself because I realized that I did something that had significance. You know, and I tell my son today, I says, live your life so that when you leave something behind. I didn't invent the remix, but I was one of the forefathers, along with Tom Moulton, Tom Savarese, Jim Burgess, some of those guys, the early DJs that were kind of just messing around and figure something out. But I'm still here to talk about it 40 years later, having mixed thousands of songs, because I still love the music. So I survived that period. Paul Simpson was an intern of mine back at WBLS in the 80s. I used to play Paul's tapes on BLS. 2004, Paul calls me, says, oh, you still got your stuff, your equipment and things? I'm like, yeah, he says, I'm doing a mix. He says, oh, Marvin Gaye, Funky Space Reincarnation. I didn't know who Paul was doing a mix for. So I was just the vehicle he was using to get it done. Paul's parents get sick. Paul has to go to Florida. So he's got no option but to put me in touch with the guy at Universal, Harry Weingart. John Morales, the John Morales. Eminem mixed John Morales. I'm like, yeah. He's, oh my God, I didn't realize it was you. And we start talking about the mix. And he's like, oh, I wish I could put my hand through the phone on the fader. And I said, where do you live? So I live in Westfield. You're 15 minutes away from me. We go through the mix. I get it to where he loves it. We're having dinner and he looks right across at me and he says, I got something for you. He says, we're doing Marvin's In Our Lifetime Expanded Edition. I want you to mix the album. I've known Harry almost 20 years, and he's one of the people, along with Paul, that I could say I'm here because of them, because their trust in my ability to mix records and make them sound great has afforded me to work with the greatest artists that have ever recorded music. And I did Norah Jones, I've done Marvin, I've done Barry White, I've done Frank Sinatra, everyone, because I don't live in one genre, I live in music. I could die 10 minutes after this interview and I'll always be John Morales and the Eminem mix will live forever. You know, there's nothing more I love than walking into the #1 club in the world as a 70-year-old man and making 5,000 people dance their asses off. You know, it's thrilling to know, that you still got it.